Can't get this. Pulled. Hello? Are there any questions? Just a second. I'm not hearing you that clearly. Could you repeat?
One person in the chat is asking about the strikes.
Oh, yes. What about it? What do you want to
I'm
know?
not sure.
What the
So I
situation
think they're going to
today?
clarify.
The vote as to whether or not to strike is taking place over this weekend. So we won't know until, I guess, Monday, whether the faculty has voted in favor of a strike or not. But as I said last time, because I've been through this before, I've organized things so that the final examination based on the review questions, only review questions that we cover will be on the final examination. So in that respect, you're protected. And then also well, you have to work on your essay, and that's not a problem. So any other questions you have about the strike or anything else? Okay. So I want to cover another review question before we start the narrative. And this is the question, I guess it's 14. It deals with the position of the Jews and Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. So I think, first of all, you should begin with the Greeks, because after all, the fall of Constantinople, the fall of the Byzantine Empire left the Greek population, which obviously was predominant in Greece and in the Greek islands, but also very strong on the in Asia Minor, because the Byzantine Empire had covered Asia Minor. Now they were all under the Ottoman Empire. So that's their situation. As for the Jews, well, within the Byzantine Empire, there were so-called Romani Jews, Roman Jews. There were also, as the Ottoman Empire developed, Arab Jews in places like Iraq, it's a very important community. And also, as I explained, Mehmed II invited Jews from Spain and Germany, the so-called Sephardim and Ashkenazi Jews, to come to the Ottoman Empire. So there were these four kinds of Jews living with the Ottoman Empire, and the Jews and the Greeks were merchants and craftsmen. The Jews in particular had a role as bankers and manufacturers, and the Greeks were expert sailors, and they constituted the merchant marine and the navy of the Ottoman Empire. So that is the respective role of the Jews and the Greeks. Now, they were under the so-called millet system that began to develop under Mehmed II and was perfected by the end of the reign of Solomon the Magnificent. The millet system, of course, there were Muslims. That was one of the four millets, but the others, the Jews, the Greeks, and also the Armenians, lived in these essentially self-governing religious communities, and were subject to taxes and tributes from the Ottomans. They were considered they were infidels. They did not accept Islam, and so they had to pay a tribute, which signified the fact that they didn't accept Islam. Um, and I said overall, the millet system worked quite well. The different communities were separated from one another in many respects, but also they got along for the most part. But over time, as I explained, as the Ottoman Empire began to slowly decline, there was growing tension. The Greeks, their position, there was relative decline, but the Greeks and the Armenians did better because the Western powers who were obtruding themselves, interfering, favored them and disfavored the Jews and the Arabs. So that's basically the answer to that question. Does anything occur to you in terms of this elaboration, or do you want me to say something more about this, or is that okay? Okay, let's move on now.
Could you,
Yes.
1 second? Could you describe all of the different sects of the Jews again? Like all the different sections?
You want to know, you want me to repeat the four different four different kinds of Jews, or what?
Yes, yes.
Yes, well, there were the Greek Jews who were called Romani because the empire was called the Eastern Roman Empire. So these were Romani Jews. They were essentially Greek-speaking. They were part of the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire had fallen. So they were just, their culture was Jewish, but also Greek. Then there were the Arab Jews. There still are Arab Jews. That is to say, their culture was derived from the Arab countries. They lived in the Arab countries where the Arabs were predominant. And then there were the Spanish Jews, the Sephardim, who were the richest community, and they had been expelled from Spain. They were the most literate and the wealthiest, and they were in terms of manufacturing, in terms of finance, they were the most important in the Ottoman Empire. Finally, you have the Jews from Germany, and later on from Poland, and these are called the Ashkenazim. In today's world, it's the Ashkenazim, those from Poland and from Eastern Europe, who dominate the Jewish communities today. And so, for example, in North America, and indeed in Winnipeg, the dominant community comes from Eastern Europe. It's the Ashkenazim Jews who dominate. So that's the setup. Okay, let's turn back now to the narrative of Indian history. And last time, what we're looking for is, in the first instance, is how Hinduism is a very, it doesn't have like perhaps Judaism or Islam or Christianity, a clear outline of a theology. Hinduism develops over time and is rooted in a very large literature, which is very disparate, and also varied ritual practices and many, many different gods. And so we're just trying to sort of locate or sort of explain the slow development of Hinduism. This is the main theme of this narrative that I'm giving you at the present, because what happens is that this Hinduism and Hindu culture, it develops in ancient times. It continues into the early Middle Ages, and then is subordinated to Islam. Islam basically conquers India, and the Hindus are subordinated to the Muslim population. and they really don't reappear politically until the 19th and early 20th century. The Hindus really begin to recover their position. And of course, this leads to conflict between the Muslims and the Hindus, which has continued right down to the present. A lot of the sort of Hindu nationalism consists of, on the one hand, getting back at the Muslims who dominated them for so many centuries, and also basically keeping down the lower castes. The Hindu nationalism is rooted in the upper castes in Indian society. I'll explain caste a little bit later. And this system tended to subordinate what were called the lower castes, and indeed the so-called untouchables, or Dalit, who are at the bottom of the caste system. And it's basically a nasty business, in my opinion. But I'm sort of trying to explain where this Hinduism, Hindu culture, and this contemporary modern Hindu nationalism comes from. So this is what this is all about. Now we saw last time that it's in the Indus Valley that the first sort of stage of Indian civilization develops. This is a Bronze Age civilization. It is based on irrigation, and it comes in about 2600 BC. It continues down to around 1700 BC, and it seems that it fell apart largely as a result of desertification, that is to say, growing aridity in the western part of the Indian continent dried out the land, and even irrigation couldn't keep it, this civilization going. And we do know that certain rituals, and one of the key gods of Hinduism, the god Shiva, is already present in the Indus Valley civilization. Then, of course, come the Aryans, and the Aryans are very important in terms of Hinduism because they bring in the Sanskrit language, which becomes the religious language of Hinduism, and really only a minority of the population really understands Sanskrit and understands the text. These people will eventually become the Brahmins, as I'll explain a little bit later. And this is very important. And so, too, is the fact that it's under the Aryans that apparently the Vedas, the first religious texts of Hinduism, which basically are religious or poetic writings, are produced during this period. So this is a new stage. And I pointed out that there's a lot of disagreement about the Aryans. They were warriors, they were pastoralists, they raised horses and cattle. But whether they actually conquered or just infiltrated into India after around 1700 BC is a very controversial point. Because there are all kinds of historians are disputing this. Some historians cling to the idea that the Aryans actually did invade and conquer. More contemporary historians are arguing that no, it was a kind of infiltration rather than a conquest. But the reason it is so controversial is that the modern Hindu nationalists who like to connect themselves with the Aryans argue that it was a conquest and that the Aryans were some sort of superior elitist group. In other words, a kind of racism or racialism is involved in this idea of conquest. And we see the parallel in Europe, as I explained last time, where German fascism connected itself with the Aryans as somehow the superior white element, both in India but also in Europe. So it's fraught with this kind of dispute and connection with racism, both in India and in Europe. Any questions about what I said? Now, let me find my place. Second. Well, a new stage in Indian history appears here. I'll a new stage in Indian history appears in the instead of the Indus Valley, to the north and east is the Ganges River, which is the most important river in India, comparable to the Mississippi in North America, or the Rhine River in Europe. The Ganges River, which about 1000 BC, this great river and plain was covered with jungle. And here we see the development of the emergence of the Iron Age. Up to this point, the only metal that exists is copper and bronze. But around 1000, as in Europe and the Middle East, the Iron Age begins around 1000 BC. And this means that iron axes and plow points are available to the people. And after 1000 BC, this jungle is cleared and this becomes extremely rich agricultural land, the Ganges River. It becomes the center of Indian civilization from this point onwards. And peasantry develops, villages, and eventually towns, and small kingdoms, if you like, emerge between 1000 and 500 BC. The Ganges River Indian civilization flourishes between 1000 and 500 BC. Now, this is an important period. As I say, there are small political kingdoms and so on, but it's in this kingdom, finally, that we see the full appearance of the so-called Brahmins. This is a key group because these are the people who understand Sanskrit and read the Vedas and the additional religious texts that are being produced, and they become the dominant element in society because of their religious power, if you like. They can be considered priests, if you like. And what is very notable is that we have, during this period of the Indian kingdoms, not only do the Brahmins appear, but below them, three other groups appear in Indian society. And this is an absolutely key element of Hinduism because these are called at this stage the Varnas, and they are the beginnings of what we recognize later emerges as the caste system. So on the one hand, to come back, the Hinduism begins, we can say, under the Aryans with the Vedas and the use of Sanskrit, but it is beginning to consolidate because of the appearance of this religious elite, the Brahmins, who have a monopoly over the interpretation of these Vedas and the other religious texts. And under them are subordinated the other three groups. Below the Brahmins being the highest, the next group are the warrior landlords. They're clearly now, there is in these kingdoms, a warrior landlord class, and below them are farmers and merchants. And finally, the last or fourth group are the laborers and the slaves. So to repeat, the four Varnas are the Brahmins, then the warrior landlords, then the farmer merchants, and finally the lowest caste or class, the laborers and the slaves. Now, these groups have a special quality already at this period because they are considered to be hereditary. And if you belong to a certain Varna, say you're a farmer or a merchant, you cannot move up and you cannot move downwards. You inherit your position and you remain in that position. Furthermore, you cannot intermarry with anybody from a caste that is above you. Say if you're a farmer or merchant, you cannot marry a woman from the warrior landlord class or from the Brahmin class. So this is called endogamy. You can only marry within the Varna from which you emerge. And it is notable that at the bottom, it is estimated something like 25% of the population are in the lowest Varna, that is to say, the class of laborers and slaves. And these are the underclass, which later are called the Dalits or the untouchables, the lowest class in Indian society. So this period sees the emergence of basically the proto-caste system. Now, why do I call them proto-caste? Because this is just the beginning of the system. The system isn't fully consolidated until round about 700 AD. So this is way back around 800 BC. So there's a slow process by which the Varnas that are clearly identifiable in this period, nevertheless, they don't fully emerge and crystallize into a permanent setup until about 700 or 800 AD. And they're terribly important because from this point onwards, they are characteristic of Hindu culture. And people are just caught in one of these groups and they remain there forever. If you're a Brahmin, you're in a very good position. But if you're a Dalit, if you're a member of the underclass caste, you can never emerge from this caste, from this lower caste position. There's no social mobility. And the thing is that this setup, as I say, consolidates around 700 or 800 AD and is still there, if you could believe it. In contemporary Indian society, people still ask which of these groups you come from. And this prejudice against especially the lower castes is still there in Indian society today. So it's certainly modern India the governments have made efforts to mitigate and indeed erase this prejudice, I would call it, but it persists. And I could say today, under the government they have at the present, which, as I said, is a radical Hindu nationalist government, this caste mentality has staged a comeback, if you can believe it. So it has a great importance in understanding what India is all about. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay, so a point that needs to be mentioned is that these trends are particularly evident in northern India. They start in the valley of the Ganges, which is basically here. Remember, the Indus civilization is located here. We're talking about the Ganges, and it spread southward. But the south, we should say, isn't as much affected by this development of the Varnas, this development of the Brahmins. It's particularly in northern India, and especially in the Ganges plain, that this crystallization of Hindu civilization is taking place. The South is different. They don't speak the same languages. And the religious history of the South is different. And the people have evolved into this, what we call Tamil culture, which is very different from the culture of the North. I would make that distinction. Certainly, the North tends to predominate in the history of India, but the South has its own Tamil, Dravidian, and ultimately their Buddhism becomes more important in the South. There is a difference between northern India and southern India. Now, this period of the kingdoms lasts between 1000 and 500 BC. And it is superseded by a new period, which is called the period of the empires. And the period of the empires lasts between 600 BC and 600 AD, the age of the empires. And this is a period, whereas the period of the kingdoms between 1000 and say 600 or 500 BC, there were small political entities. After 600 BC, you have a period of consolidation. The political structures become larger and larger, and finally they culminate in the last and the greatest of the political entities of the Hindu period, the so-called Gupta Empire, which lasts between 320 and 600 AD. This is the culmination of classical Hindu civilization between 320 and 600 AD. Everything that I've talked about up to now basically consolidates during the so-called Gupta Empire. Let me see if I can. Yes. This is the Gupta Empire. You can see virtually the whole of India, with the exception of the southwest, forms part of the Gupta Empire in orange, as you see here. So this is the kind of, if we go back, you start with the Indus Valley civilization, then you have the Aryans, where there's no centralized government really. Then you have the period of the political kingdoms between 1000 and 500. Then there is the period of the empires, and they get larger and larger until they culminate in this Gupta Empire, which dominates between about 320 and 600 AD. This is the culmination. And we could say that Hinduism is, especially the Brahmin control of the religious life, and religious life becomes very important. And the development of the Varnas, with the Brahmins at the top. Remember, they control the culture, which is essentially religious. And they're in a position to sort of articulate or frame the cultural life. They put themselves at the very top of Indian society, of Hindu society, where they remain. Below them are the military men, landlords, and then you have the merchant farmers, and finally the outcasts, the underdogs, the Dalits, at the bottom of society. Now, during this period of the empires, and particularly during the Gupta period, there arises new religions. Two new religions appear during this period, which are, in the history of Asia, are quite important. I'm talking about Buddhism and Jainism. Both of these religions originate in South India, significantly where Hinduism is less strong. Buddhism and Jainism develop, and I would say they develop as a kind of protest against the constraints, particularly the proto-caste system of Hinduism. And so I would say that Buddhism and Jainism have a more universal quality to them from the beginning, which is, of course, consonant with the development of large imperial political structures. There is a certain symmetry between the development of consolidated political control, imperial control, and the development of these more universal religions. Now, what is characteristic of both Buddhism and Jainism is, first of all, their hostility to the emerging caste system, as I've tried to explain, which is a core element of Hinduism. These are religions which sort of reject the stultifying social and even cultural effects of the caste system which is emerging. And they also take a position which is, they tend to be pacifist, and they reject the military and political violence is eschewed, is rejected in both of these religions. The most distinctive element, especially in Buddhism, is what we call the transmigration of souls. The idea that the body disappears from one life to another, but the soul continues to exist. And based on, there is a kind of movement of the soul from one body to another, depending on whether or not you are a good or bad person. in terms of living beings, you can move up and down. The soul migrates, and you can start out as a worm or a grasshopper, and you can move upward in the hierarchy of souls, up to basically a kind of sainthood can be experienced. The soul has history. So there is a soul, what we can call a mobility of the soul, if you like, which expresses itself in this concept of the karma. But notice the contrast between this conception, a religious conception of a certain religious mobility, with the rigidity of Hinduism and its caste, where basically you're frozen into your position forever. So there's a difference. And I would say that both Buddhism and Jainism become wild because of the power of Hinduism in the north, and because of the onset of Islam a little bit later. The influence of Buddhism is limited in northern India. It does spread to the rest of Asia. Like Buddhism becomes predominant in Japan. And insofar as there is a religion in China, Buddhism is very important in China, or for that matter, in Indochina. But it never really takes over northern India. Northern India remains Hindu or comes under the influence of Islam. Now, so we've seen how gradually Hinduism develops right through the Bronze Age, down into the early Iron Age, down through the age of the empires. Now, all of this comes to an end in the 7th century AD, because there is an invasion. Earlier, there had been the so-called Aryan invasion. Well, the second great invasion of the Indian subcontinent occurs in the 7th century, when a Central Asian tribe, which is also disturbing Europe, the Roman Empire, and so on. In the 7th century, they invade and they destroy the Gupta Empire. The age of empire comes to an end, and we have between 700 and 1100 AD what we call a dark age. Large-scale government ceases to exist in this period, and likewise, towns disappear as well. Towns and trade disappears as well. There is a dark age where basically only a local economy exists, and there is scarcely any, there are only very small, what I would call kinglets, very small areas that are dominated by small kings during this so-called dark age. There are no towns, there's little in the way of trade, and so this is a so-called dark age. But it's very important, this period. This is, in some ways, the decisive age. The disappearance of the earlier, more sophisticated Hindu civilization leads to a consolidation at the local level of Hindu society and Hindu culture. So I need to speak at some length about this dark age, because this is just prior to the Muslim invasions, and it's just after the age of Hindu empires. And it's in this period that Hinduism and Hindu culture, which is going to persist under the rule of Islam, under the rule of the Muslims, and for that matter, under the rule of the British, it fully matures during this dark age. So I want to speak about this at some length. Now, there were, as I say, kinglets. There were small kings, but the fact that they didn't have towns, they didn't have money, there was little or no trade, meant that the power of these kings were limited. Well, the thing that they do is, in order to have some control, is that they establish local officials. Government is largely local in this period, and most of the local officials who are appointed are Brahmins. And these Brahmins in this period, in the absence of larger forms of government, now consolidate their control not only over the temple life of the people. The Brahmins control the Hindu temples. They also now get control of most of the local officers. And as I say, local government is decisive. There is also, beside and under these Brahmins, a sort of military landlord group known as the Rajputs. And these two groups, the Brahmins and the Rajputs, they dominate Hindu society from this point onwards. Control over temple life, control over the local offices, and control over the coercive apparatus falls into the hands of this group, which from the beginning and the end, these people now control Hindu society in India. Now, in this period now, the caste system, which has been basically reinforced by Brahmin control, it becomes absolutely, completely established all over northern India. So you have a localized government, you have the Brahmin temples, the Hindu temples, and Brahmin control over local offices supported by the Rajputs. And then you have the caste system with below the Brahmins are the military landlords, below them are basically the farmers, and below them are the outcasts. Now, the last element of this system that I'm talking about is the economic aspect of it, which is very important because there's no money, there are no towns, there are just these villages all over northern India. And these villages are basically autarkic. Their economies are self-sufficient. There are no merchants, there are no towns, there's no money. And so the villages are basically self-sufficient. Most of the people are farmers, but there are also craftsmen in these villages. There are shoemakers, there are furniture makers, there are candlestick makers, there are iron workers, iron artisans. The artisans manufacture for the peasants, and the peasants provide the artisans with food. There is a barter system. It's a self-sufficient barter economy. If you like, it's a closed economy. And these villages develop independent of the rest of the world. And you can imagine the landlords are collecting a tribute from people. So are the Brahmins, and the landlords and the Brahmins together basically control these villages. Now, this system is essentially inert. It doesn't change over time. Because it's self-sufficient economically, there's no innovation in this system. And it's this setup that I'm talking about that's fully established during this dark age which has given India the reputation of being an inert society. In the 19th century, in the early 20th century, scholars in the West, including Karl Marx, remarked on the fact that nothing happened in this for centuries and centuries in India. It was essentially an inert society, and they dubbed this setup the Asiatic mode of production, essentially stagnation. And so this is how India got this reputation as being essentially a stagnant society. Well, this setup lasted until about 1100 AD, and finally a new element introduced itself in the form of the Muslim invasion of India. Remember, up to this point, we're talking about Hinduism. Well, now the Muslims come in and they become the dominant element, the dominant, well, you can call it the ruling class over India until the British arrive. The period of Muslim rule, 11 or 1200 AD until 1753 and the British conquest of India. So we need to consider this at some length. Now, actually, the Muslims first appear around the beginning of the 8th century, around about 700 AD. The first sign of the intrusion of the Muslims actually occurs around the beginning of the 8th century. And to sort of explain, I'll pick this up next time. Have a nice weekend.